Let's talk about why the new atheists aren't really that new. You know, those guys are getting incredible press. I understood that Richard Dawkins, who wrote this book called The God Delusion, sold 1 million copies in a year. And he's at about 1.5 million right now. I watched on the net, you can probably still find it, a meeting where he spoke to an audience of about 300 people in the South. And I teach at a Methodist school, and we know something about tent meetings. I have never seen a more perfect example of a revival meeting. Richard Dawkins stood up without notes, and he preached it like it is, or like he thinks it is, right? There's no God, and science really proves that our genes are the workers, and we're the results, and there's no broader purpose. Religion is stupid. It's basically a bad thing. As Christopher Hitchens says, religion poisons everything. And people were nodding their heads, and they were really into this. And then they stood up and they raised their questions. But you know, it's really interesting that the questions didn't sound like academic questions. These were testimonies. These were conversion narratives. And I'll never forget a guy standing up in the way back of this auditorium and saying, you know, before I read your book, Richard, or Professor Dawkins, I was lost in the darkness of religion, and I didn't know the true way. And then finally, when I read The God Delusion, I saw the light, and now I'm buying copies for all my friends, and I'm telling everybody that I can how exciting this is, because this has changed my life. When you listen to that sort of discourse, you realize that something different is going on here than science. Or when you look at the Beyond Belief meetings that have been taking place in San Diego. And this is a bunch of the new atheists getting together to say, you know, the reason why we're really here is to get a broad movement going that will support science. We want to use the feelings and the emotions of traditional religion in order to get the word out that science is the only show in town. And when you look at the materials from Beyond Belief, you realize what's really going on in this entire debate is to add a sort of religious urgency to atheism. Add a religious urgency to science alone. Science is the only game in town. So then you go back and you say, so what are they actually saying as scientists? Well, what are they saying? Richard Dawkins wrote a pretty good summary of one particular approach to genetics, to biology, in the 1970s. The Selfish Gene sold 1 million copies, and it's one of the clearest, most readable statements of what it would be like if all biology turned on what happens at the level of genes. Fundamentally, he has never changed that position. He's still a gene theorist all the way through. The only trouble is biology has moved on in the meantime and has a rather different view of how the biosphere works. But we'll leave that aside for the moment. Then you take that one interpretation of science and you add on to it a particular philosophy, which is naturalistic, materialistic, anti-hierarchical, anti-theological, and anti-religious in every respect. And then what you do is you try to build in these negative quips about religion as much as you possibly can throughout the book. So that he has a sentence, it's in the early 30 or 40 pages of The God Delusion, which describes the God of the Old Testament in the harshest possible terms. Sam Harris says at one point that religious believers are about on the level of those who engage in genocide and who own brothels. And again, Christopher Hitchens, he only has 3 words to say about religion. Religion poisons everything. But what's effective in the PR about the new atheists is that you claim for these, well, I'll call them prejudices about religion, the mantle of science. So you get to claim that science proves all of these things. The trouble is, there's scarcely an argument in The God Delusion, and far fewer in books by Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens. You end up then with a vacuous claim for religious conclusions, for anti-theological conclusions, with nary a philosophical argument to support it, and with a thin veneer of scientific respectability holding it all together. Is the new atheism really new? No. There are far more interesting views through the history of modern opposition to religion. People like David Hume or Immanuel Kant raise the hard questions. And this is a cultural phenomenon. I think it's about time that we name it like it is.